today I have the pleasure to welcome in the studio Mr. Robert Goebbels. Thank you very much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
A little bit of introduction from Mr. Goebbels. He was a member of government from 1984 until 1999. First as a state secretary for foreign affairs, foreign trade, cooperation and small businesses. And from 1989 you were minister for economy, public works, this during 10 years, for transport until 94, and from 94 until 99 for energy. You were a member of parliament from 1999 until 2014, and you signed...
European Parliament.
European Parliament, absolutely. And you signed in 1985 the Accord of Schengen, Schengen, where you have a street with your name along the Mosel, which is, I think, a very rare honor. Just to conclude on your life, you were born in Luxembourg City in 1944. Your father was a shop owner, was selling machines. Your grandfathers, one of them was working at Arbed, the other one was a laborer at Heinz von Landewijk, the well-known company from the Gare. You studied at the Lycée de Garçons, but you repeat very often that you had two diplomas that no longer exist today, so you consider yourself as without having any diploma. You still started your career in journalism, first in Paris for a few months at Jeune Afrique, then at Luxembourg Journal for a few months.
In between, I had to go to the Luxembourg army because
for
in those years I did even 9 months and 2 weeks.
Because you had a little bit of a problem, yes. You did 2 extra weeks for reasons I will not explain here. After Luxembourg Journal, you really found your career started when Jacques Pos hired you at Tageblatt. You would end up doing a full career with Jacques Pos, and this is where your political career was kick-started when you went to your first event. Basically, this is how you jumped into politics. You became secretary. Even before, you were a member of the LSAP. We'll come back on this. Just to conclude, you were also president of the Luxembourg Association of Journalists during 2 years, and you were general secretary of the Luxembourg Socialist Workers' Party, LSAP, from 1971 until 1985. So, thank you again for taking the time. I would like to talk with you about 3 main things. Let's start with the first period, which is the 60s and the 70s. Can you describe to us how was life in Luxembourg in the 60s, especially in the context of Europe? Was Europe a big thing after the Rome Treaty?
It started. People at the beginning were not really aware that we were a part of something larger. But one has to remember that when Luxembourg was invited to join the European steel and coal community, the famous SECA, as Luxembourgers used to say, we were only invited because we had in these years a very important steel industry. Luxembourg produced in these years more steel than Italy and more or less the same amount of steel than the Netherlands. Otherwise, nobody would have called us to join this venture.
As one of the 6...
as one of the 6 founding fathers of
SECA.
Of SECA, which would become the European Union as we know how. So it was thanks to the steel activity, which was rather important, which enabled us to join this European experience. But that said, the 60s were rather good years, but society was changing, and the main change occurred in 1968. First of all, I was married in 1968, but that had no incidence on the rest of the world. But in 68, youth rebelled against the order established after the Second World War. The famous Révolution de Mai 68.
In Paris, yes.
Which, yes, not only in Paris, it was worldwide. It started even in Berkeley in the US, came over to Europe and all the rest, and changed a lot of the mentalities. And from there, also the economy started to change, and after the 60s, the steel industry started to run into trouble, which meant for Luxembourg that we had to reinvent our model.
Yeah, so let's jump into this. We have 1973, a big energy shock. Our main industry, and we basically had only this and agriculture and a little bit of Europe, but it was very tiny at the moment, at that time. So how did the country react? We know that the index was generalized at that time. We know the tripartite was created at that time. How do you remember those periods? How did people react when all this mess happened?
The steel crisis was really a tremendous challenge for our country. We almost collapsed as a country. You may remind that in '74 there were elections, and the outgoing government with our statesman Pierre Werner lost the elections, and a new coalition came in. Gaston Thorn from the Liberal Party, who became Prime Minister, and Manny Berg from the Socialist Party, and who was a trade unionist. He was Vice President of the biggest trade union. He became the number 2 and Minister of Labour.
It's interesting to mention that this came after a separation of LSAP.
Yeah, that was before. That was in the 70s. In the
Yes.
70s, yeah, there was a split in the party. But in '74, the old party, if I may say so, survived as biggest party. We had a tremendous result in the election in '74, and were able to make a government together with Gaston Thorn from the Liberal Party. And this new government was totally hit by the steel crisis. The energy crisis, the steel crisis, everything came together. So we had to reinvent the country, and we did it thanks to the spirit of we call today the tripartite. In these days, the two main trade unions, the more socialist LAV, Luxembourg Arbeiterverband, the predecessor of OGBL, and then the Christian trade unions, they tried to work together with the government and with the patrons, with the management, and we find a lot of solutions which were unique in these years. So we invented, for instance, these extraordinary works financed by the state, financed by a specific tax, in order to keep people employed.
So you could have a steel employee having an extraordinary work.
Yeah, they work.
And it would be gardening or painting houses.
In these years, there were roughly 30,000 employees in the steel sector, workers. So more than half of them were employed by the state in order to paint schools, to clean woods, to construct all kinds of things.
It was really emergency measures.
Yeah. And the good thing of it was that people stayed employed and didn't had to go into unemployment, which was the tragedy in most of the countries around us, where people were simply laid off.
And you didn't have ADEM at the time to pay you a lot of money?
When the government started in '74, there was not something like ADEM.
Chômage or
No. The only chômage we had was chômage pour intempéries.
Yeah.
When there
So
was bad weather.
Unemployment was only money was only paid for bad weather.
For bad weather, but not for real unemployment. And as a former Belgian Minister of Labour, Ernest Klein, always used to say, if you are out of work, beginning it's a tragedy, but with time it becomes a vice. And we avoided the vice. We kept people into work and tried to find new jobs. And in these years, in 76, 77, the then Minister of Economic Affairs, Marcel Maat, he tried to bring in new investors, new industrial companies. He succeeded, he brought some very important ones like DuPont, Nemours, and a couple of others. But that was the continuity of the next governments in order to try to compensate the foreseeable decline of the steel industry with other industries, because we wanted to have an economy as balanced as possible.
And one detail here, I got the privilege to interview Mr. Marcel Maat a few years ago, and he was telling me that what he was doing was rent a suite in New York, a big hotel, for 1 or 2 weeks. And because he was Minister of Economy, Infrastructure, he could really do the short path and say, yes, I do this, I do this, I do this, and you could sign a deal in no time.
Yeah, that was one of the advantages of being a minister of the Luxembourg government. I did the same when I became First Secretary of State and later on minister. In fact, from 84 to 99, during my time in government, I was always involved in trying to diversify our economy. I was always involved, even in my years as Secretary of State. I traveled the United States, I traveled Japan, I traveled Korea, I went to Italy, to Scandinavia and so on, in order to try to interest foreign investors to come to Luxembourg, to create here new jobs. And we were rather successful. In my 15 years I spent in government, I was able to bring some 120 new industrial companies to Luxembourg, which created close to 20,000 new jobs.
Yeah, I remember you were not alone, because you had...
No, it was not my private success, it was...
no, but I have in mind you had Grand-Duc Héritier Henri at the time.
Of course.
Who was relentlessly traveling with you all over the world.
I always... I made an awful amount of visits around the world together with the then Crown Prince Henry, because he was a door opener. When we arrived somewhere, we met the CEO,
of course,
and the CFO, and their wives.
Indeed.
Because they always were interested to meet the real prince and the wives.
Just for clarity for the viewers, maybe just to conclude on the 16th and 17th.
Okay.
So we could say it was a strongly dependent industry or steel industry dependence. Then the shock. I think we got very lucky at the time, because almost by chance, I think this is when German banks started in the 70s using Luxembourg as a financial place. Is that right?
Absolutely. But there were also at least 2 Luxembourgers who spearheaded that evolution. One was Albert Dondlinger, and the second one was Edmond Israel.
Okay.
And what happened in these years, mainly the German banks, they tried to escape to the supervision of the German Bundesbank, the German central bank. And therefore they came to Luxembourg in order to be able to do business out of Luxembourg they would not be allowed to do in Germany.
But there was no banking secrecy until 81.
Yeah, that was not the banking secret, but there were rules which were considered to be too tough in German, so they came to Luxembourg. But in fact, they never. Capital adequacy reason and a lot of things.
Okay.
And they thought that they would be more at their ease here in Luxembourg. There was in these years no banking supervision. It was a commissariat aux affaires bancaires headed by Albert Dondlinger. And Albert Dondlinger, his main job was to ease things and not to make difficulties. So more and more German banks came, and with the German banks some others came. The first US banks came, and so on and so on. And so
The first Chinese bank.
they came later, a little bit
Bank of
later.
China,
Bank of China was the first one. They came, if I recall well, in '68 or something like this. And it was Gaston Thorn and Jacques Pos
Okay.
who went to Beijing and who sold them Luxembourg as a place for Bank of China. And Bank of China was the first Chinese bank outside China
Wow.
established,
In Luxembourg.
established somewhere in the world.
Incredible.
We're in Luxembourg.
Yes.
Now we have 14 Chinese banks in Luxembourg. 14.
And again, it's a lot of information, but the bond was steel, because when they were doing railways in the 19th century in China, they were importing steel from Luxembourg. I think that's when the bonds were made.
They imported steel from Luxembourg. They bought one of the old furnaces of Esch-Belval,
Wow.
which they reutilized, and mainly they bought technology from Luxembourg. Paul Wurt, who had one of the best technology for blast furnacing, they sold their technology to the Chinese, and I remember that as a young Minister of Economic Affairs in '92, I made a trip to Beijing in order to sign with the Chinese government a state-to-state credit from Luxembourg to China. So Luxembourg lended money to China, $5 million.
Okay.
A ridiculous amount if you look at the figures nowadays. But in these years, the Chinese were very grateful to have outside creditors.
Yeah, and this is why we need to take a step back. It's difficult for viewers to remember. I mean, we talk, if we're still now going back to the beginning of the 80s, there is USSR. Chinese is not very developed. It's going to come a bit later with Shanghai and some very slow process, which now have become extremely impressive. So just to conclude on the 70s, we could say Luxembourg in trouble because of the steel crisis, but a bit lucky because some German banks are coming here. And
we did also our part of the equation by keeping people in work.
Yes, a lot of resilience.
A lot of resilience, and we tried to transform our economy to diversify it as best as we could.
Exactly. So now we can jump into the 80s. We can start immediately when you enter into the government, not as a minister for the first government, but can you describe at that time, first, how was Europe doing in '85?
But in '85, there was a lot of optimism around in Europe. The 80s were good years. In the Soviet Union, there was somebody called Gorbachev. And I remember the first meetings we had at NATO level. I attended the first meeting after the summit between Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev in Reykjavik.
Okay.
And Reagan came to Brussels in order to give us a brief about this meeting. And the question was, can we try that guy? And I was among those who, at my low level, I was not one of the main actors, neither at NATO nor elsewhere, but I tried to say, yes, we should try this guy. He wants it really. He knows that the Soviet economy is rotten, and he needs us in order to rebuild something. Which happened, by the way. And so in these years, there was the opening in the East, less tensions. And at the same time, we had in Europe two real statesmen, François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, which had a clear idea. They wanted to develop the European Union, and they worked together. And fortunately enough, as new president of the European Commission was appointed an extraordinary man, Jacques Delors, who stayed there for 10 years and who really revolutionized the European Union. Delors came with the simple idea, yes, we are an economic union, but we have no real common market. And so his idea was, let's develop a real common market with the 4 liberties: free flow of goods, free flow of services, free flow of capital, and free flow for human beings. Unfortunately, the last one was not
a reality.
Not a reality. Mitterrand and Kohl, they tried to make a reality out of this. And at the European summit in June '84, Mitterrand, who chaired that European summit, proposed to make out of free circulation of citizens a common policy. An immediate no for Maggie Thatcher.
Of course. Margaret Thatcher.
Maggie Thatcher,
only
no, not with us. That led the 3 prime ministers of the Benelux countries to write to Mitterrand and Kohl and propose to do something only among those 5 founding members of the European Union, which was accepted by Mitterrand and Kohl. By chance, Luxembourg had in '85 the turning presidency of the Benelux. And for practical reasons, we did a negotiation about free circulation for citizens at the seat of Benelux in Brussels. And as Luxembourg had the chairmanship of the Benelux, I became happy chairman of this little intergovernmental conference, which led to the Schengen Agreement. I don't know if I should continue or if you want to intervene yet.
It's very good. I mean, what I find really incredible is that 20 years before, we were in the middle of a missile crisis. The end of the world was near. We had the empty chair policy from de Gaulle. I mean, Europe was not sure to survive, I think. No. And 20 years after, suddenly there's a big appetite. Some almost coincidence happened, and we end up in '85 on the Maria Street in Schengen. I think you mentioned to me before the interview there was not even a lot of press, or even the mayor of Schengen didn't really show up. But you signed this famous photo. You signed the agreement.
2 things. As I think Bob Dylan said, times they are changing, fortunately for humanity. Second, when we started what would become the Schengen Agreement, nobody really believed into it. In the capitals, obviously, there was none of the foreign ministers in these years who was interested. So all foreign ministers designed their number 2s, the Secretary of States. So we were 5 Secretary of States in order to negotiate and to sign and to implement. And that was perhaps lucky. I once said to President Barroso later on, the European Union always tries to appoint high-level groups. Next time you better try with low-level groups. They may achieve more.
It works better.
They achieve more. What happened? And this happened with Schengen. Schengen at the very beginning was not much. We introduced a green point.
Yes, on the car.
On the car. And if you had a green point on your car, you were able to declare to the custom officers who were still there I have nothing to declare. But people especially in the frontier regions between Luxembourg, Germany, France, Belgium, but also between France and Belgium, Netherlands and Belgium, and so on, Germany and France, they accepted this wholeheartedly because they were so fed up with all those silly controls by custom officers and so on. But then, unfortunately, something happened which was logical in a way. Custom officers who were still allowed to make controls par sondage.
Of course.
They could choose, pick out somebody.
Yes, a statistical control.
Yeah, but they ended up by picking out only those with a green point.
We were smiling. I have nothing to declare.
Have nothing there, green point. If they had something to declare, yeah, of course, they were 40 and had to pay. And so there was so much pressure to come up with a system which would allow to cut down control on internal borders totally. And the same 5 Secretary of State continued to negotiate, but then the real problem started because we had to invent everything. We had to invent a common visa policy, a common asylum policy. We have to invent cooperation between the polices, mainly in border regions, and so on. So we invented the so-called Schengen Information System, which in fact is some kind of European FBA located in Strasbourg, where all the informations about crimes, stolen cars, and so on come in, are dispatched, and thanks to the Schengen Information System, 10,000 of stolen cars have been found again, and a lot of crimes have been elucidated. The Schengen Information System was so effective that Britain, who was never a part of Schengen, was in the Schengen Information System.
Wow, they wanted that part.
Okay, we had to invent all this. It took us 5 years because in these years the opposition against the idea of abolishing border, they mounted everywhere. There were on the left side people saying that we would create the fortress Europe, and on the right side there were people saying we would open all gates to criminality and to all kind of shabby things, terrorism and so on and so on. So there was a mounting opposition, and it took us 5 years to come out with a second Schengen Treaty, who was signed also in Schengen, and it took an additional 4 years in order to implement that because some parliaments were very reluctant to adopt that.
It had to be voted by each parliament.
By the 5 parliaments, and especially the Netherlands, they were very reluctant. But finally, it was adopted, but then the idea of free circulation of people really gained a momentum which was almost crazy. The rest of Europe, all member states and even beyond, wanted to be part of Schengen. First came the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the Italians, and so on and so on. And that European summit in Amsterdam in 1997, in fact, the Schengen Treaty was incorporated in the European treaties.
Yes.
It's now a part of the treaties. In Amsterdam, Great Britain and Ireland got an opt-out. Ireland because they have only a common frontier with Great Britain. Cyprus was never a member because they doesn't work. They have an internal border which unfortunately is there. But all the others came, and even Iceland, Norway, Switzerland and Liechtenstein became member of Schengen. The Swiss came, and it was the only popular vote in Switzerland where a majority of Swiss voted in favor of more Europe, the only one.
So my question to you is, do you think it's just that the good idea of Europe and free circulation was finally mature, or is it more a good idea meeting history with, for example, the fall of the wall of Germany?
It was both. It was both. The idea matured slowly, and people demanded for it. People were fed up by those city controls on borders when they went on holidays in neighboring countries and things like that. And also, thanks to Schengen, commerce, mainly in border regions, lived up. Look at Luxembourg, look at the streets of how many German, Belgian, French crafts companies are working every day in Luxembourg.
Yeah,
there are Luxembourg companies working outside and so on. So the former frontiers have disappeared, which encouraged economic exchanges and which encouraged also human exchanges, and one of the good side effects are the commuters coming each and every day to our country.
Yeah, I can share maybe with you some numbers. At the time, from the numbers I have, there was 160,000 workers in Luxembourg, including 22,000 cross-borders. The latest number I had from last year were 485 workers, including 228,000 cross-borders. So we have a number of workers tripled, number of cross-borders went times 10, which is just crazy.
And represent close to half of our working population, and Luxembourg would not be able to exist anymore without the work of the commuters.
Yes, and then of course in the 90s there was an additional help for Luxembourg's economy, which was a tech revolution, creation of the internet, which of course boosted finance and IT activity. So this is where you left the government in 99 and went for the European Parliament during those
Let's say I was ousted in 99 in government.
It's another way to say it.
No, to be crystal clear, I would have loved to continue in government, but unfortunately the government with the new Prime Minister Jean-Claude Juncker and myself as the leader of the Socialist Party at that time, we had made a little reform of pensions rights for civil servants. And the civil servants, which are roughly a third of our electorate, they didn't appreciate.
You ended the 5-6 rule.
Yeah. And at the elections in 99, Juncker lost 2 seats. I lost 4, and the Liberals gained 5. That were civil servants who voted against Juncker and the Socialists, and voted for the Liberals. So Juncker had to make a new government with the Liberals, and I was out.
So if we look now at the third part where we're interested, I don't want you to comment necessarily on what the other government did. We had Jean-Claude Juncker, if I take your formula, was ousted in 2013. Then we got 10 years of Gambia, so this coalition between DP, LSAP and the Greens. And last year, in October, CSV came back in a coalition with DP. So what I'm interested about is your view now, with everything you've experienced before. First, a view on Europe. How do you feel Europe is doing with all your experience at the Parliament and in Luxembourgish politics? What's your view today?
The European Union is something which is going to stay, because there is no alternative to it. We Europeans, we are now 480 million or something alike. We have a larger internal market than the US, a larger one.
Sure.
But unfortunately, our internal market is not evolving in the right way. There is now this report of Mario Draghi about the lack of competitiveness of Europe, and he is unfortunately right. We have in the European Union some 43 million companies working. 43 million companies. Most of them are very small or medium-sized. And according to Draghi, at least 60% of those companies don't want to grow because they think there is too much bureaucracy. It's too difficult to really live up and compete and become larger.
The risk is not worth the reward.
The risk is not worth the reward, and in fact, Europeans in general have become risk averse. From 50 high-tech companies in the world, only 3 are Europeans. From the 50 biggest research centers in the world, there are, if I recall well, 23 Americans, 18 Chinese, and 5 Europeans. And one could continue like this.
I read the report, it's quite shocking.
The figures come from the report, of course.
This is why he's asking for 800 million of investment, a billion per year.
Yeah. Which and the problem is, can we afford this? Personally, I think that we could afford it, especially if we would use Brussels in order to channel the necessary investments in infrastructures, in more research. The fact is, and that is also said by Draghi, the 27 European governments invest more in innovation than does the US government. But only 10% is invested in common project. And 90% of the money is lost in national endeavors. Subsidies, not all probably very reluctant. And that's one of our big problems. The United States, they innovate. We regulate. And unfortunately, the last commission, they did an awful amount of silly regulation. And I'm pretty sure that with the new von der Leyen commission that will continue, because we fear everything. We are not open to new technologies, be it artificial intelligence, we first want to stop. New technologies always impose themselves. They may have negative effects, and you can try to balance those negative effects, but you cannot avoid new technologies. The same goes for biotechnologies. I personally was a staunch defender of modern biotechnologies. I was even the chairman of the Select Committee of the European Parliament for human genetics. And I learned a lot there. And I learned that with what we call in Europe Frankenstein food, the OGMs, or now with CRISPR-Cas, you can do magnificent things without poisoning humanity. The fact of life is that a lot of countries throughout the world have adopted OGM. Nowhere, somebody died from OGMs. And the same goes for CRISPR-Cas technology, where you can re-affect in the same genome. There's no genomic transfer, but in the same genome you can re-affect the sequences for better vegetables, for better animal health and things like that. But we are scared about everything. We blockade everything. And the evolution is in the US, is in China, is in some Asian countries. But unfortunately, in Europe, we are falling behind.
And what do you say to people who describe the EU, the Commission, as disconnected from the real economy? And I could apply the same analysis to the Luxembourgish ministries. You know, there's all this money coming from Europe, invested in nobody knows exactly where. And the people you were mentioning, you were Secretary General des small companies, not Secretary General, sorry, Secretary d'État or small companies.
Small businesses.
Yes.
And I broke, in these years, I broke up the Luxembourg small businesses, and nowadays they are thankful to me.
I remember that at the time you allowed, for example, a baker to sell the bread with a sausage, for
absolutely, example. Absolutely. That was forbidden. Imagine that was forbidden. Huh?
Yeah, when you look today at Stefan, the butcher from Steinfort, who is now opening bakeries. So we see that there was a lot of moves. So what do you answer to people who talk about this disconnect? And there's an example I heard recently, for example, you know, when Jean-Claude Juncker lost the election in 2013, boom, 1 year after, he's president of the Commission, and people struggle to understand how can you be kicked out from your own country and promoted as leader in Europe.
Yeah, the European institutions are a very peculiar invention. In a normal democracy, there are elections, and those who are in government, if they lose, they are out. Takes sometimes a couple of weeks, even months. Yes. Like in the Netherlands, for instance, or in France recently. But they are out. But in the European Union, you can continue. And the problem is that the treaty foresees that the president, male or female president of the Commission, is designated by the heads of state of government. And that's a political deal. Mrs. von der Leyen became president because Macron pleaded to have a woman as president, and as fortunately for him, Mrs. von der Leyen speaks well French. Okay. That was the ideal combination. But I don't think so that things should work like this. And then when Mrs. von der Leyen or Juncker or all the others before him were appointed, they have a blind date with 26 candidates nominated by national governments. We had an excellent commissioner in Brussels, Nicolas Schmidt. Everybody in the European Union said that he did a tremendous job as Commissioner for Labour. But Mr. Frieden decided that one of his party members should become our next commissioner. I have nothing against Mr. Hansen, but he has no experience, not even experience as a minister, and now he will inherit the biggest budget of the European Union. I wish him well. But the problem is, how can you construct an efficient commission with blind dates, with people you don't even know, and you can't hardly change. Sometimes the designated commission presidents can call the prime minister and say, please send me a woman. What happened 2 or 3 times this time? Okay, but that's not the way how those important jobs should be.
So we could call it maybe a governance issue.
It's a governance issue. Yeah.
But we could also explain it with our conversation, keeping in mind that in the 60s, Europe was more or less nothing. In the 70s, it had to deal with a massive crisis. In the 80s, when the Schengen Agreement was signed, nobody even saw the potential. Basically, everything kicked off in the early 90s, and we are only 34 years ago. So it's very... it's too young, basically.
It's young, and we also tend to forget the successes. And some successes occurred outside the treaties. Schengen is a good example, but also the euro. And I'm
Massive
one of
success.
those who say that the euro was one of our biggest successes.
It is.
The euro is now the second hardest currency in the world after the dollar. King dollar is still everything. But 20% of all the reserves of central banks throughout the world are held in euro. And we could do more if we had the guts to do it.
That would take us to the Letta report.
Yeah.
Finish the job on the common market.
There is a lot to finish and a lot to do, but the problem is we don't really dare to do it, and the mentality in the capital is still nation first.
Of course.
Nation first. And it's obvious if a government is attacked at home for a European policy, the answer is always the same. It was not me, it was Brussels. But Brussels only proposes. The decisions have to be taken by heads of state and government, by Council of Ministers, duly elected, and by the European Parliament. There is the political responsibility, but still it's the Brussels bureaucrats. Yes, there is too much bureaucratism in Brussels, but they are not the faulty ones. The faulty ones are the politicians who don't dare to stick to the decisions they have taken together in Brussels or in Strasbourg.
Absolutely, and maybe I'll keep your word that the EU is here to stay, and we know that it's now facing another economic difficult time.
It's our own chance. One possibly last figure. In 2050, that's not too long ago, the world population was 30% people from Europe, Australia, and North America, America and Canada.
9 years later.
Since 2050, the world population has tripled, 8 billion now. And our part of the world, the so-called West, the white West, will be 13%.
The first number you said was what, 1950?
1950, 30%. Now we are around.
So it was 74 years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the change is absolutely massive.
Because mainly the Chinese, the Indians, the Indonesians, the Turks, and a lot of others.
Africa also.
Africa will be 2050 the continent with more than 2 billion people, most of them young.
Yes, and most populated country right now, India, which has passed China. So I think we get your vision very clearly on Europe. Let's talk about the economy. I think when you were in the government, because you had still the shock of the steel crisis, you really were fighting to be diversified. And we know that today, I don't think this is the case anymore. We're highly dependent on finance. How do you analyze this evolution? I know that Jeannot Créquet was trying hard to go into tech, go into health tech, go into logistics. I think logistics worked. We know that Xavier Bettel was all in for the startup nation. But if we look today, it seems that industry has gone down. Everything else has gone down. It's just a very monolithic industry with a lot of finance. 75% of corporate taxes come from this industry.
Yeah, that's for sure. My goal when I was Minister of the Economy was always to try to have an as balanced economic structure as possible. And therefore I invested a lot in trying to bring in industrial companies from all over the world, and we succeeded rather well. Some 120 new companies came during my years, creating some 20,000 jobs. But I also tried to diversify into other directions. I created the Luxembourg Maritime Pavilion.
Yes, Maritime Pavilion, yes.
A lot of people laughed at me in these years, but my goal was not to have many ships cruising under the Luxembourg flag, but my idea was a ship has to be financed and refinanced, has to be insured and reinsured. All the stuff they transport has to be financed and so on and so on.
Exactly.
And for me, it was a good diversification of our financial sector.
It still exists.
And first of all, the pavilion still exists. It's one of the very few administrations of the country which earns more money than it spends, one of the very few, and had an impact mainly on insurance. But a lot of people don't know that maritime insurance is, after life insurance, the second sector here in Luxembourg.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Look at it.
Yeah,
maritime insurance. Unfortunately, there was only one bank who tried to follow the idea to finance also ships and all the rest. It was a German bank who unfortunately has disappeared since. But that was the idea behind, and so we took a lot of initiatives, the creation of Société Européenne des Satellites in '85. We tried to have all kinds of activities in each and every field. People even thought that we could invest in filmmaking. We did it, but the economic result of it is rather doubtful, but it was a nice investment. And so on and so on. Now we have to continue. We know that we depend too much on the finance sector. Banking is shrinking. We have, when I left government in '99, we had 220 banks. Now I think we are roughly around 110. Among those 110, only a quarter of them really earn money. Most of them are structures, more or less empty structures. Unfortunately, we have the investment funds.
That's good.
But the investment funds, there we have to see also the reality. We are back office here in Luxembourg.
Back middle office, yes.
Back middle office, but those who take the decisions, they are in London, in New York, in Singapore, Paris, Frankfurt, wheresoever. They are not here. Here they are number second or number third who execute the orders. I once asked a Swiss banker the following. A good friend of mine said, from the decision of your headquarters to leave Luxembourg to the execution of this, how much time will that take? His answer was, that depends if we take the furniture with us or not.
Wow. Otherwise it's a few clicks.
Of course. And I hope that we will be able to maintain this very diversified sector of investment funds, on family office and all the rest. But that depends on the general environment, and if the Dutch or the Irish or the new British government does something very special, they can be out of Luxembourg very soon, and then we will really suffer. And then when I hear public discourse here, I was yesterday at a conference organized here by the Chambre du Travail and Forum about wealth in Luxembourg. And if you listen to those people, wealth is something we should try to avoid. It's better to share nothing than to have wealth to share. I find this ridiculous. Of course, l'argent ne fait pas le bonheur. Yes, but it helps.
Of course. And do you see any possible diversification? Because you were doing this job of attracting Japan at the time in the 80s was extremely wealthy, and I know you brought Kikioka Golf Club where I started operating in '96. So do you see with your experience some avenues that have not been explored, or shall we just go back to the real economy, like the small businesses you mentioned, who maybe don't want to grow, but there are so many of them here that altogether they are the plan B for the economy.
It's difficult to find new, how should I say, new avenues, or we succeeded rather well by selling our sovereign rights.
Okay.
By selling our sovereign rights. We sold our sovereign rights when we bought in Radio Luxembourg, when we bought in Tele Luxembourg, when we bought in SAS, and so on and so on. Etienne Schneider.
Robert Goebbels.
No problem. We'll take that part.
Sorry.
No problem.
Where was I?
The plan B. So you were talking about the sovereign rights?
Yeah, we sold our sovereign rights. Radio Luxembourg, Tele Luxembourg, SAS, things like that. Then we, Etienne Schneider, when he was Minister of the Economy, he tried to build up a sector exploring and exploiting the moon. I think the idea is not false. And he had some success. We have now a couple of little, or more or less, little companies here who are in that venture. But I always told him the day when it will really be successful, the big ones
will
move too, and they have more means than we have. That's
that's an example. The Luxembourg Space Agency is an example of those agencies. They spend a lot. I know that there's actually a lot. It must be 100 small startups.
They are welcome, and some of them may evolve. Also in the US, from 1,000 startups, there are only 2 or 3 who really succeed.
The big question, because I interview a lot of them or I have coffee with them, is they're here, but not much is happening. Because in reality, we know we're not going to start extracting the moon in the near future.
And when it really happens, then there will be the big guys who build their own
space
launchers, like Elon Musk and Bezos and all the others, who will have more assets than we.
They have an easy access, and this is one of the big startup goals.
So I'm a little bit pessimistic, and I'm also pessimistic in another way. For the moment, Luxembourg has become the center of a larger region, and we attract talents from all around. But what is a little bit disturbing is the fact that the population in Lorraine, in Sarre, and in Rhineland is shrinking, like in Luxembourg. The Luxembourg population is shrinking too, and badly. We grow because we have all the foreigners coming in, and we were very open to give away Luxembourg passports, even to Brazilians. But around us, the population is shrinking, which means that in 10 or 15 years, we will have less and less people coming as commuters. Already nowadays, especially young ones, they don't like to come because it's too difficult
it's too expensive.
Too expensive. To live here is too expensive. They earn more. The fact of life is that somebody earning in Luxembourg only the minimum wage, 2,500 euros roughly.
Now it's more than 3.
No.
Minimum wage?
2,560 minimum.
Unqualified.
Of course, I'm speaking now. The lowest minimum wage. But the median salary in France is 2,100, which means that the young girl or the young boy from Hergondange or from Ucrange coming to work in Luxembourg only for the unqualified minimum wage earns more than half of the French.
Exactly.
But he has to work 12 hours a day. 2 hours to come and 2 hours to leave.
Yes, yes. The commuting is a big issue, and when they want to live here, the price of real estate is so the attractiveness, of course, is a massive issue that I think everybody should work on. Maybe a last word about your experience as a journalist. You know, I don't know, when you were at school, you were already writing your newspapers. Do you think the press is strong enough to make, for example, public servants and politicians accountable in Luxembourg? Or is it too easy just to call the editor-in-chief and complain?
No, I think that the press, fortunately we have a rather diversified press still, they play their role. When I see that even in the Luxembourger Wort now a journalist dares to say that Mr. Frieden has ein kaltes Herz. That's already something. But my biggest problem is that I don't believe that most of the newspapers, despite public subsidies, will be able to survive the next 10 years.
Okay.
The Wort is sold. There's nothing left.
Mediavis, yes.
Media House, yeah, okay. Flemish editor. And what was the asset? The buildings, they are sold. And they don't belong to Wort anymore.
They belong to
the same happened to Tageblatt, where also the building has been sold. And they live on rent now, like the Wort, and like all the others. And there it will be difficult to survive, especially as obviously the habits of the young people are changing. I know a lot of young people who never touch paper, and they are on their handies and all the rest. And I said last year at the conference that my guess, and I'm not proud about such a guess, is that in 10 years none of the existing newspaper will exist anymore.
Yeah, but on the other side, you've got the law to support the diversity of the press, so I would imagine that they will raise the subsidies to make
if we can afford it.
Yes, that's another issue. Exactly. Perfect, Mr. Goebbels. Thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us and for sharing your very long experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.